Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's truly a delight to have the opportunity of discussing this book with friends at Stanford. And I'm especially touched by the company I find myself in. Anna Bigelow is someone whose work I've admired over the years. And the very dear Anjali Arondekar, I think we first met in 2017 at a conference, and it was clearly love at first conference. And her words of endorsement, of course, also appear on the back cover of my book, very generous. So I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity and very happy to be in conversation with these wonderful scholars. And a note of thanks also to people who are attending today, the various centers who are co-hosting the webinar, but also people behind the scenes, Lolita and Simrath. So Simrath, I'd be happy if you could put on the slides, the first one, and thank you so much. And if at some point my voice breaks, or internet in Germany is quite a thing, it's quite a phenomenon, so it's not very stable, and so please give me a sign and I'll try to either shut off the camera or as for today's talk, even though my book is in ethnography, I'll stay rather meta and give you a broad overview, and hopefully that will fly. Because for the juicier bits or the juicier ethnographic bits, you will have to read the book. That's an invitation. So the next slide, please. The statement, "Shrines break the order of straight lines," is quite delectable to the queer ear. Writing on Islamic saints and space in Cairo, Amira Mittermeier, to rather different ends, observes how saints' places, with their concentric circles of sacred affect, but also as doorways to other realms, excite and uphold a non-linear spatial arrangement, counter to the checkerboard order of modernity. A somewhat comparable challenge to linearity prevails in Anand Taneja's rendering of Delhi's saintly ecologies. Here, not just saints, but the co-presence of Islamic jinns, Hindu deities, anonymous spirits, and talking animals disrupt neat conceptions of historical time and religious belonging in a post-colonial setting. I have described Islamic saints as queer companions, not as mere provocation, well, that too, but to bring home the greater point that affective intimacies with saintly beings, figures, and places bear affordances that include departures from established religious lines and social norms in present-day Pakistan. Those of us who study Islam know that religious deviance, unstraight modes of piety, and crooked orientations to society are part of the ways in which Muslim mystics have historically expressed their inclinations towards the divine. It informs my interest in parsing the saintly modes and religious means by which a certain unstraightness coheres in the present. This refers in particular to the capacity of enshrined holy figures to alter our relations with history, as well as preserve possibilities of staying temporally aslant to the contemporary. A key insight, this is a key insight that unfolds through my book, Queer Companions. Next slide, please. Such leanings and learnings are tied to my decade-long research in Sehwan Sharif, a much revered and ancient site of multi-faith devotion in Sindh, Pakistan. In fact, nowhere in Pakistan is the sacred as dense and as unstraight as it is in Sehwan. This location on the Indus River is a formerly Shivite and now Sufi site of pilgrimage, where old-world deities and demons cross-fade with their Islamic contemporaries. It is home to the shrine of Pakistan's most beloved figure of devotion, Lal Shehbaz Qalandar. He's a figure that straddles multiple histories and identities, and he's also remembered in as many guises. An ancient river deity who rode on fish, a Shi'i proselytizer of the 13th century, an awaited reincarnate for the Hindus, a wandering antinomian Sufi who rose to the skies in the form of a falcon. Such plural narrations do not sit straight with the modern nation state's desire for, but also its attempts at creating singular or exclusive Islamic pasts. Such historical complexity, or let's say this kind of sacred density, informs part of the broader ways in which I conceptualize queerness in the book. Next. The protagonists I rely on are fakirs, women, men, and gender variant ascetics who abandon home, question inherited lines, and forego reproductive economies of family and work. Most of these figures, drawn from across the country, are led to Sehwan on the basis of dreams and visions, and many perform as healers and spiritual guides to pilgrims at the shrine, but also in the town at large. In many ways, my book, Queer Companions, is a set of fakir life stories. The book's chapters narrate fakir lives as these unfold in excess to ascribe lines of the familial and the social. An unchaperoned mother of 8 traverses a cross-country geography of shrines. An intersex child abandons home on the promise of the state. An ascetic gives up celibacy for a girl he loves. A woman contests place among tombs in a graveyard. In assembling such life stories, my book offers the insight that such betrayals of the straight, this way of going astray, let's say, takes place on the basis of people's growing bonds with Islamic saints. Now, part of what I'm pursuing in the book, refracting queer affect through saintly archives and Sufi religious matrices, is the epistemological work of regathering intimacy in ways that do not squarely home in its Euro-American genealogies and queer's secular orientations. Next, please. I read intimacy in very Belantian ways, but via the Urdu and Sufi notion of qurb. I won't repeat the long meditations on intimacy that are present in the book, but suffice it to say that to be qareeb, let's say the one who bears qurb of the saint, points to an always evolving, never stable feeling of being close. Such being on the verge takes intimacy as a temporal account of affectivity, the never knowing of relations in the present, the future such intimacies disclose or foreclose, the socio-historical relations they can expand or frustrate. In this regard, the book illustrates how saintly bonds become affective formations which tie individual society and the state in a public architecture of intimacy. Speaking of public, one of the contentions my book advances is that saintly intimacy is sustained by the material affective infrastructures of the state in Pakistan. Next. The cross-reading of affect and governance that I have pursued, especially in chapters 1 and 2, is tied to how I understand the Pakistani state's relationship with saints. In this particular regard, I have pointed to the often inseparable dynamics of governing saints and governing with saints. For example, set in a grove, Baba's story in the first chapter reveals how an administrative presence of the Pakistani state at saints' shrines like Sehwan extends into wider imaginal modes of dream, song, and image, and whose overlapping pull draws fakirs and also other pilgrims to find an advanced affective access to the saintly. Situated in the tomb hall of the shrine of Sehwan, her stories in his darbar revolves around the questionable authority of a woman fakir, Amma, in a men's prayer space. Among other things, it illustrates how women's spiritual careers are secured and advanced by the state's arbitrating role at public shrines. The provocation in this pair of chapters is that as fakirs come close to the saintly in Pakistan, they also draw nearer to the state. Next, please. In chapters 3 and 4, I have argued that saintly intimacy hinges on critical performances of the body, insofar as one's closeness with saintly figures and locations is corporeally afforded. In other words, it is a public performance of fakir disguise that sanctions the body's departures from socially inherited objects and situations. Zahida's story of crisis, and this is chapter 3, as it unravels in the shrine courtyard, points to how fakirs tarry under tormenting and turbulent conditions, Or what happens when saintly orientations fail, become naughty? In other words, when intimacy no longer affords what it might have once promised us. Love in a time of celibacy is about a scandal at a fakir lodge. Through Murad's life story, we come to understand how saintly bonds can come undone or show signs of disaffection, especially in the face of rival intimacies and competing objects of desire and devotion. Such conflicts around intimacy reveal how sexuality and sacrality are complexly conversant in fakir bodies, but equally the ways in which ideas around sexual intimacy shape fakir understandings of saintly relations. Next, a more dispersed idea in the book, and something which is only taken up in chapter 5, is what I describe as worlding with saints. The concept conveys the idea that intimacy involves forms of affective knowing through which one's ties to the world are sutured anew. Through the story of two fakirs contesting place in a single graveyard, I describe how coming close to saints affords an elaborate sense of time and place. When in the company of more than living beings and mythic creatures, fakirs acquire an affective hold over complex ecologies, intimacy becomes that interface through which multiple, at times unresolved or irreconcilable histories of the post-colony whirls together. Such affective attachments with deceased saints and their tombs is less an act of rejecting the world in my book, more a means of becoming worldly. I also take the position that the very intimacy that winds up fakirs in complex ethical political relations with saints ensures also that saints, though buried, can have an affective stake in the world. Next, please. I want to take a few moments to offer a brief note on what it means to think queer and religion in tandem, in companionship, so to speak, without giving into easy antagonisms that come along with these terms. The ambition of my book has truly been to explore whether queer theorizing can find other lives in the epistemological reserves and affective resources that religious ecologies and life worlds make available to us. The question, put another way, is this: can religious concepts find grounding in quintessentially secular sites of queer theory, which are shaped in the first place by religion's presumed absence? Or to lean on Arondekar and Patel's argument in Area Impossible, how might we overcome theory's geopolitical bias that already determines why places such as Pakistan or settings like religious shrines, locations I write from, with, or about, do not strike us as possible sites for queer thinking or world making? I hope it is clear to my readers, but also my listeners, that the intent of my book is neither to rehabilitate queer in religious tradition, nor is it an anachronistic move to repair histories. It is not satisfied by queer jacketing religion either, that is, over-reading scripture or tailoring religious life worlds to a queer cut of our choice. My proposition to think queer religiously does not entail a frenzy of finding one in the other, Islamizing queer or queering Islam, but involves the intricate task of exploring a companionship that such that scholars categorize religion and queer can remain in creative suspense or question at least their historical disinclination. Reading queer religiously incites a troubling of religion as a non-definable Eurocentric and colonialist category in much the same vein as it imagines queerness in more than rights-based, non-metropolitan, extra-secular, and beside Euro-American cultural terms. Also, queer, when conjured through sacred aesthetics and religious affect, is no longer just a designator for non-normative gender and minoritized sexualities. It is additionally that device by which we are able to ask ourselves whether queer history is always only a history of queer activism, narrowly defined, gay rights, and so on, or are there ways of thinking more capaciously, let's say, ways in which a history of queerness can be conjured that makes space for and is made up of other, and in this case, distinctly religious ways of being unstraight in and to the world. And fakirs, I believe, show us precisely that. Next slide, please. In this final section of my talk, I want to switch gears and return to a set of photographs, which, as I discuss in the opening pages of the book, had led to a heated argument with my mother. It is in fact a photo template in which a photographer for hire at the shrine had artificially inserted my image alongside the saint of Sehwan through computer-aided techniques. Pictures like these were popular mementos. The one featuring Benazir Bhutto and the saint was an all-time favorite. So was this one with Bigelow, the saint's most favorite disciple. Thank you. On the left side of this composition is a particularly affectionate scene. Bigelow has his head resting in the saint's lap, while the saint's body is seen leaning forward, his palm securing the disciple's head in a loving embrace, so close that his body is almost indistinguishable from the body of the saint. On the right side of this template is the space where the pilgrim's figure is usually inserted and where you see me from 2012, actually. The elaborate blue tile facade of the mausoleum serves as backdrop, while Lal is additionally featured flying above in his popular falcon form. What would tip things over with my mother was a different iteration of this image, in which Bigelow's face had been virtually replaced with mine. Next, please. In this version of the image, next slide, please. Yes, thank you. In this version, I was no longer just an onlooker standing next to an affectionate scene between the saint and fakir. I was the one in loving embrace with the saint, my head securely placed in his lap, my body queerly close to his, arguably too close for comfort. Interestingly, people at the shrine read the embrace as the saint's approval of my research, and some couldn't stop commenting on the likeness of my face to that of the saint's favorite disciple. As I shared the photograph with my mother, I had counted on her good humor, just as when she had responded to other templates, the one with Benazir Bhutto, for instance. But to her, the saint's affection in the photograph was neither dormant nor a laughing matter. If not the power of saints, the power of intimacy was unmistakably compelling. As my mother put it that evening, a line had been crossed. That shrines were frowned upon at home was hardly news to me. Invoking saints or seeking their assistance had no place in the reformist version of Islam I had grown up with. A visit to a shrine, however ubiquitous in the Pakistani landscape, never featured in our daily lives. Venerating saints was in fact shunned at home. I was also aware that my growing involvement with Sehwan as a site of intellectual inquiry and my constant discussion of its affective emotional life worlds evoked all shades of anxiety at home. Did I believe in miracles of the saint? Was I taking part in rituals? Had the saint appeared in my dream? These were questions regularly asked of me. It wasn't their views or my parents' views on saints and shrines that struck me, rather a paradox that shone through their micro-anxieties. Saints allure that my family so vehemently rejected, harbored as if a future property, enduring affects born, if not from their remote acting beyond the grave, as is commonly believed of Islamic saints, then of my more deliberate and immediate ways of coming close to them. Here, closeness, even if digitally doctored, conjured up my parents' worst fears that I might be believing in the saint. My affinity for Sehwan, which my father had once compared to the risk of drowning, was an unfolding peril insofar as such ties introduced new or unstraight historical objects, ones which did not extend shapes of our religious inheritance and were therefore unstraight. In short, saints were risky companions, shrines a risky business, and a simple photograph in this instance, a harrowing record of a wayward affair. Whether the saint embraced me or I embraced Sehwan, the photograph now stands witness to my own labors of coming close and crossing far. Queer Companions captures an entire decade of arriving and departing, staying, coming to know, and not knowing enough. Questions of intimacy I center in this book are somewhere, somehow, also inflected by my own coming to terms with distance, both physical and emotional. Or the queer affects I identify in relation to fakir lives are in part to make sense of all that I might have stirred, upended, or given up in the wake of coming close to Sehwan. If anything, Fakir labors of love have taught me that coming close to an object means becoming remote to certain others, that intimacy involves political moves with ethical stakes. Theoretical labors put aside, all scholarly citations taken away, what remains at the heart of my book are stories of coming close, ways of worlding shared with me over the years, some also as parting gifts. Through the labor of writing lives and piecing together biographical fragments, I'm constantly reminded of the limitations I face in terms of access and material, the temporal character of life itself, as well as the constructedness of the ethnography as a genre. Murad, a fakir interlocutor of mine, who once suggested that I ask less questions, also told me that he wants to be like me, an explorer who travels to new locations, not to record stories of others as he described my work to be, but to write his own story. Somewhere between crossing far and coming close, along labors of finding, accessing, composing, and telling fakir stories, in, across, and between the pages of this book, I hope to have found a story of my own to tell. Thank you for listening.
Could I go ahead? Thank you, Omar. It's such a delight. First and foremost, Mubarak. And I will also remind everyone here that I'm speaking from the unceded territory of the Awaswa speaking UP tribe and the Amamatsun tribal band, whose descendants are assembling ways of retrieving indigenous rights and representation. I say this every time I make an acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is not a relationship to land. And what we need more, as indigenous scholars have reminded us, is a new relationship to the ways in which land appears in our intellectual and affective ecologies. I have had the pleasure of thinking with Omar, of being a queer companion of Omar's for so long, and it's been so wonderful to watch his work grow, to learn from it, and also to admire the lyricism with which he writes. As someone who is a fake historian and works on historical archives through a literary compass, I'm always grateful for the craft with which Omar writes, thinks, and allows us in. And I think that's one of the things I want to say. So a big Mubarak on all fronts. So I am going to serve as a fluffer for this conversation. My job is to get a rise, literally, metaphorically, affectively. And because I've had the pleasure of reading the book twice now, I read it when I was writing the blurb, and then I reread it in preparation for this conversation. My questions are less about what you've accomplished, which is tremendous, but more about the afterlives of the book, because it is the beginning of many conversations, I know. So I'm super glad. I have three very small comments, and then I'll turn it over to Anne, and we can return to whatever you fancy. So the first comment was actually about the photograph, which you began with, and I was very glad you showed our comrades in the ether that image, in case people have not had the pleasure of reading your book, because you end with that image as well in the last, in the coda, when you return to your mother. So I wanted to get you to think a little bit more about the curation of that image, and how the curation of that image and what it allows the book to do in terms of the intellectual intimacies that unfold. And what, when you speak of the image, you talk about how it's computer generated, how you sit with the fellow and say, can you put me on his, and the guy says, well, I've never done it before, but sure, why not? And the kind of technology of that curation falls away as your book moves through these different technologies of intimacy. Now, I was very curious about that because, as you know better than I, particularly in thinking about religiosity, the space of technology, about how people come close to Allah, the comportments are more and more mediated and mediatized, right? So I was very struck by that image because, as Omar had very kindly invited me, along with Nida Kirmani, to a conference in Lahore, and I too have a picture with Jinnah that has been doctored from the museum, which for most Indians would be equally blasphemous. But it was, but the doctoring was so ordinary, the technology of entering so ordinary. And your book is a summoning to enter into intimacy. But I wanted to sort of return us to this other, curated genre that and I see your invitation as we are like your mother. We begin with consternation, and then you walk us through why that consternation needs to be undone or folded through. So I wanted to hear a little bit about that image and what, because it's an archival trace, right, that appears in your book and then returns at the end to remind us about how the staging, you talk about uneasy bedfellows, right? That it's not just intimacy can be a chance encounter, it can be. So, and I also ask this because about the curation of your intellectual companions, right? So obviously my dear friend and teacher, Lauren Ballant, is all over the book, but I also see the imprint of Sabah Mahmood's work, which you don't quite engage with, and it's fine, but because of the cultivation of intimacy that is so central to your book. When you talk about the fakir, especially in the introduction, when you talk about the woman who leaves her home and has to learn how to cultivate a fakira, right? Avatar, let's mix our mythologies. So I wanted to, so the comportment and your own comportment in that picture, I was really struck by this throughout the book as I was reading. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about, that conversation as well and where that was, because Bellant's image and I think stamp you is everywhere. But I wanted to also hear a little bit about that. I can say more, but I want to just ask quickly my two other questions. And again, Omar, you don't have to answer anything. You can just nod off and move on to whatever you like. The second question is also one of the most animating and compelling sightlines, if you'll forgive the reference in your book, which is temporality, right? You're very interested in what these worlds that you allow us to enter, inhabit, and migrate out of do to our idea of temporality, queer or otherwise. But I was also thinking about what would it mean to not be in temporality. So for example, when I read your title, Queer Companions, I kept thinking, well, most of us who grew up in South Asia will say, hey, do you want to keep me company? Which is not about the value of time, but it is about time having no value, right? So I'll say to you, Amar, I want to go just to the bazaar. Will you just keep me company? So I was interested in the non-valued, non-accruing value of temporality. What it would mean to be in time without teetering to the future or to the past, but to settle in. And I couldn't quite figure it out, but it was something that was nagging at me as I was reading again and thinking, well, you are saying something different because you use futurity quite a bit in your book, right? You're very interested in how this form of this line that you keep calling up allows us to see ahead. But it's about a sitting in time rather than being in and out of time. So again, it was just something that was, I had thought about more this time than the first time when I read your book. And the last question is sort of a vulgar question because it's not something you are particularly interested in, but I think your book will open the conversation, which is about the question, which I can't believe I'm asking this, but I was compelled to, is the question of rights and representation, which is obviously not on your ambit. And the reason why I ask is because your book is very insistent, and I think wonderfully so, to talk about governing saints and governing with saints, right? It's a phrase you use at the end to talk about how the state, the Pakistani state's relationship to these shrines, how they've been taken over, but how people are still have access to them, etc. And I was thinking about what your work could do, would do, has done to sort of mobilizing or allowing different landscapes for people who are doing more traditional work in Pakistan on LGBTQI, etc. rights, meaning how can this lens of, queer religiosity, religiously queer, however you arrange the grammar of your summoning, how can that help? And again, I know that's not your project, but my job is to make you uncomfortable a little bit and get you to think about, because I do think there's a lot here, because Pakistan is very unusual in its embrace of certain kinds of figures, right? So anyway, I'm done. Whatever you fancy, but it was such a pleasure to revisit, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Anjali. That was great. And also touched on a number of the themes that I also, of course, picked up on as well, particularly that of temporality and the way it's woven through the structures here. Also this idea of disciplining the body and the practitioner. So in reading this book, I was thinking so much about the relationship between death or the dead and futurity, as Anjali also referenced, and this notion that you often invoke here of heterotemporality, which has, I think, a specific kind of resonance in this context. So whenever we're talking about beings like saints, ghosts, ancestors, jinn, we're dealing in these multiple time zones, right? We are trying to conjure a world that both was, is, could be, and runs these unstraight lines, as you would have it, and I think correctly so, that go through time in nonlinear fashions. So as I mentioned to you before we started, we taught this book this quarter in a seminar I'm teaching on death, power, and religion. And we are looking there about questions of how thinking with the dead or the more than living allows us into these imaginaries of the future, whether in terms of what happens in the wake of death or deaths, or as vectors for this worldly ideals of justice and righteousness. And so some of the thinkers that we've also touched on there, like Christina Sharp's work in the wake, and Avery Gordon's Ghostly Matters and her subsequent work as well. For Gordon, she thinks about this through this idea of haunting, that there's this there's a quality of that there's a something to be done is characteristic of haunting, she says. One can say that futurity is imbricated or interwoven into a scene of haunting itself. And so sort of leaving a question aside of whether Gordon's haunting, which reveals these sort of repressed and unresolved moments of social violence, and her idea of ghosts who have this kind of agency and intention and claim upon the living, whether that resonates or lays comfortably beside the kinds of saintly affects that you explore in Queer Companions. But I think it does bring this question of heterotemporality and futurity that I would love to hear you explore a bit more. And you point out in your work, and I'll just throw this quotation up there so everybody can see that it's actually read it along with us. You say that as saintly intimacy blooms, it lays bare otherwise futurities, so to speak, emergent leanings into new or previously less available possibilities of life with saints. Fakir lives compel us to reappraise our own understandings of proper religiosity, ethical self-fashioning, and projects of a moral life. And so in that citation, I think it calls to mind this idea that these otherwise futurities that come into sharper focus for you in relation to what you're calling this worlding with saints. And it also brings up notions of what exactly is proper religiosity, which of course is part of the narrative with your mother, and academic assumptions of what proper religion is. And so I think in your queer religion, thinking about queering religion itself as a study of religion, I think there's a lot of interesting conceptual projects about what constitutes Sufism, Islam, or religion itself. And I think that's particularly true to pick up on a theme Anjali put forward, that a lot of studies of religion, especially those that are approaching Islam ethnographically these days, focus so much on this ethical self-fashioning and the ways in which an individual navigates an intermingling of collective and institutional imperatives. So these pious projects, a la Sabah Mahmoud and Charles Hirschkind, have emphasized spiritual self-discipline and power through the way in which people become associationally conforming to particular norms and ideals. But in your work, you're pointing out another really interesting aspect that I think has not had adequate attention by highlighting a sort of a disciplined defiance of modes of discipline through various modes of performed nonconformity. And you look at this through the concept of the fakir etiquette of bes, the modes of dress and comportment and speech and emplacement, as being a very disciplined practice, as a manifestation of a particular moral imagination, and as you call it, a way of making space for otherwise ways of being in the world. And so I'm curious if you feel a tension between these approaches, this kind of very normatively oriented, discursively oriented modalities that we see in Mahmoud's excellent work, and the kinds of self-fashioning that's happening in these Fakiri Sufi modes that that you are touching on. I have lots of other questions, particularly around that go back to some of your earlier work on materiality and material culture. I loved your essay in the volume Muslim Matter that you co-edited, in which you argue about how important the attention to materiality helps to create a more capacious idea of what it means to be Muslim. And throughout this book too, the attention to the mundane, the everyday, the not spectacularly or clearly marked or coded as ritual or religious is actually some of the most important places to look for what actually is happening, not only in a religious life way, but also in a social and cultural one and historical one. And so I think particularly in chapter 5 for me, that comes into the sharpest relief, where you're not focusing on the spectacular dhamal and the ritual practices, but instead really looking at the everyday ways of appropriating and taking up space that's happening, and the material practices and the sensory sensibilities that people adopt to build a wall, to mark off a space, to literally take up space within a graveyard, that, you know, this insistence on being in place and also being legible to a particular audience and to changing audiences as being legitimately part of this world, which again, sort of pushes back against the kinds of disciplinary religiosity that may be more dominant in other spheres of society outside of the context of Sahwan. So I will just pause there, and I have so many questions, but mostly just with Anjali, like, give us more, we want more.
Thank you so much, both of you. These are excellent provocations and engagements. I mean, the questions you pose and the readings you offer are both generous and generative. And I'd like to sort of take comfort in what Anjali said earlier about the afterlife of books, and that, you know, conversations grow. And I'm really grateful that you're pointing out to things. Anjali, you are pointing out to things that are, let's say, on the sidelines of the project in a way. And sometimes things also fall on the side way as as we write books and as we develop projects. And Anna, you're pointing to really somehow the heart of the book. You've really managed to point to things that I've been cautious about, I've been thinking about, and maybe one question that also overlaps, and perhaps I can give some kind of I can reflect on that. Is this also my own understanding of when I was developing this project and sort of at least figuring out what I was going to write about and the material that I was encountering in the field. I think I was always conscious of the fact that the book that I'm writing will sit oddly in the anthropology of Islam, or at least oddly in the conversations that are there in the anthropology of Islam. And I always like to quote Samuli Shilke, who said that there's too much Islam in the anthropology of Islam. And I, in a way, so, I was writing at a point in time when I at least was kind of tired of the piety turn, let's say. And this whole thing of ethical self-fashioning and the work is, I mean, Sabah Mahmood's work is excellent, and it's interesting that you point out, Anjali, that it is latently there, right? But I think while writing the book, I was just trying to move as far away from that line of argument and line of thinking as possible. But of course, these are works that influence you, and there are ways in which that kind of cultivation of intimacy, as you put it now, is that one of the threads in the work. And it also takes, as Anna was pointing out, this whole language of disguise speaks to it, but also does not speak in the same vein, so to speak, or it doesn't. It takes on that let's say, path, but it leads to a different destination, I would like to believe. So I think part of that discomfort is quite present in my writing, and I think it has allowed it to become what it is. The other was also the fact, a kind of a realization that I was working on, a site that was understood to be exotic. I was writing about figures that are, seen as like these classic anthropological objects of study. And that was the other discomfort, that I do not want to write a book which sort of, reproduces that kind of, that kind of image or representation. And I think that has led me to sort of, and also, I mean, I kind of mentioned towards the end, the temporality of the field itself, right? This is a project that has spanned over 10 years, and I've been able to follow these lives over a decade, and these fakirs and their lives and their decisions, the decisions they've taken over the years, and what has happened to them and what has happened to their places and all that, has also allowed a certain kind of perspective. It has allowed a certain kind of engagement, and therefore also influenced what I've been able to say about these lives and the kind of stories I've been able to tell. To think about some of the points that you're raising, I might start with this question of haunting and saintly affect and this element of futurity. Funnily enough, that has appeared in my work on Berlin, because I've been researching with a Sufi community in Berlin for the past few years. And the other realization while working on that project was that I don't want to write another book on Sufis. And it has become work on, it has become a more auto-theoretical work, but I've also started to write about the ritual itself, which is of zikr. And I've started thinking about saints as migrant bodies, saints as haunting, Sufi haunting in Berlin, which then also comes into contact with other forms of haunting in the city, and what it does to other ways of imagining futures, or migrant futures. It's a work on migrant belonging. So it does appear in, it does feature into my work the question of saintly affect through the question of haunting, and especially through Gordon's work. But interestingly, not the question of Sevan, but in the question of Berlin. But it's to say that there are these overlaps, and there's a thread that I could draw. Anjali, your provocations are tough, as I expected. And I think the toughest for me would be to think about your last point about rights and representation. I think I'm also trying to write against that in a way, right? I mean, and you know that, but I think the only way I can imagine this conversation being in aid of that question is to think about religious inheritance, right, as a site of queer world making, and as a site of, but it very quickly falls into the frame of reparative work. When you start looking at Sufi histories as Sufi sites as a place of tolerance and sexual kind of permissiveness, let's say, it's also the other typical way in which Sufi sites have been written about, in my view. But I think that's the only connection I can draw to, because it is true that a lot of queers of faith in our part of the world, in South Asia, take comfort in shrines and their histories, right? So that connection is already there. And I think perhaps the book can just endorse it in a certain way, or sort of bolster it in a certain way. I mean, we also know that Khaja Sara and Hijra and transgender communities have long been associated with these places. So there is a history of sexual alterity and sacred, and the notion of sacred that sort of is not at odds with each other. And I think in Pakistan, I would say that some of the concepts that, and Claire Pamment has written about it, right? Some of the concepts of Sufi piety and Sufi life worlds have also become the vocabulary or the grammar for creating a space for rights, for at least for transgender rights in Pakistan, right? So there is a pathway there. There is a link between and sort of affirmative potential of these sacred spaces and these religious histories that can have a kind of resonance in political world making and the question of rights. But I think on the notion of homosexuality, let's say it's trickier in Pakistan to have that conversation. I don't know if that answers your question. On the question of technology and mediated intimacies, I mean, there's lots there. I think and you're right that it doesn't it's not a thread that I carry through the book. And I'm not really directly related to your question, but I was reminded of on mediated intimacy of how pilgrims would speak to the saint via the phone. So if you're at the shrine and I will call you because I'm not in Sevan, and you will put your mobile phone, so I will be online and you'll put the mobile phone on the saint's tomb. So I have a private moment with the saint. And that's a very common thing in Sevan. And the other thing about the photograph I would also say is that I was photographing quite a lot at the shrine. And this became a ritual because I had a camera always in my hand. And I became friends. I befriended because of this object in my hand, I befriended the photographers who were working at the shrine, right? So we would always have conversations about what we were photographing. And at some point, this became a ritual with Amin, this photographer, and every few months, we would do a template, some kind of thing. And it was my way of putting myself in front of the camera rather than just always being behind the camera and photographing. So it became this kind of mode of participation in the shrine economy or daily life of the shrine. But what I also realized was that taking photographs in the shrine field was quite an ordinary thing because people were already doing that with their mobile phones. But taking notes in the shrine field or sitting at the darbar and writing notes would sort of draw a lot of attention. So photography was also something that other people were doing so you're right that it has this kind of, it is something quite ordinary, right? Let's say it's something that people are used to. And they sort of, those are the ways in which they interact with the shrine. And it was also odd to see that a lot of them had their backs towards the saint or towards the tomb because they were getting photographed with it. So in a way, it was sort of, going against the ways in which one would behave, the etiquettes of being at the shrine. But it allowed for a certain kind of intimacy, of course, and a piece of it was a memento then you could take away with you. So it extends that frame of intimacy, so to speak. Do you want me to say more? I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time, or we're doing in terms of time.
I wonder if I might invite you to look in the Q&A at the question from Vikramaditya Sahai and see who's echoing some of the themes that have come up about the questions of how you're using the terminology of queerness, and points to an older conversation between queer as a verb, queering, and that of queer as a substantial people and purpose and persons, a more instrumental use of queer, and that of queer as about people alive and dead. So might one suggest that in working with the dead, you are confusing or conflating the necropolitics of queer activism rather than expressing some sort of difference there? I don't know if you can tease apart that question. Are you able to see it, Omar?
I'm now reading it.
Yeah. So it sort of touches on these questions about whether the distinction that you make between the work of using queer as a device to conjure versus that of an activist, that I think picks up on the point you were raising in response to Anjali.
I think it's a question of queer as hermeneutic versus queer as sutured to a body that is identifiable as LGBTQI, etc. Right? So, and you're obviously very self-consciously using it as a hermeneutic, right? So
Yeah. And I think I'm wary of, at least in the book, I try not to think of my work as queering something, at least not as a verb. Because I don't think that that's the project I'm sort of, that's a project that I'm trying to do. I think there is also, I think the place where I'm locating queerness is not necessarily in the individuals, it's not about these, I'm not talking about fakirs as queer figures necessarily. I'm locating queerness in the affective relation between the saint and the fakir. So intimacy is that space where a certain kind of queerness unfolds, which then allows me, or which sort of allows me to not term individuals as queer or not. So does that make sense?
Can I just ask something to tag on, and if I'm being a little bit using my privilege as a panelist? I know you're not queering, and I'm with you in that because, so for example, my book is deliberately called Sexuality Something and Not Queer, for all kinds of reasons which are different and the same. But I actually, again, having now read the book a second time, I was wondering, you assume queerness is a hermeneutic that has certain axiomatic purchase for the person who's reading it, right? So you don't actually tell us what you think queer is, you perform through your readings. And I thought, well, this is both brilliant and also incredibly frustrating, right? It's brilliant because you're not providing a Western genealogy and saying, I'm going to cite these theorists. You're sort of saying, it is ordinary, quotidian, and therefore, right? So why do you need the term queer? I can understand the work, the critical work that it does for you, but your book says, look, this critical work is always already part of the worlds which you enter, right? So that's, I think, what is that epithet queer? Is it because it allows you a vernacular that is shared, that when people enter your project, they can go with you on that journey? Or, I think that part I would sort of with the person who asked the question.
I very much would say, yes, it is that. It is for that purchase, as you mentioned, or this entry point that people can sort of, but what I also do in the book then is sort of, or the other term that I use is unstraight, right? And I think I talk about the fact that it allows me a certain kind of conceptual volume, but it also allows me to steer away from queer when I need to, in a way. So in the sense that then you can sort of add this conceptual volume and say, okay, there are ways in which things do not fit or sit right or sit straight, or they're sort of odd and unstraight, without having to rely on the baggage also that comes with the term queer. But I did not want to shy away from the term queer, because I didn't want to create a completely alternate kind of space and then, not name it and say, well, this is unstraight, because then what that does is that it creates what is unstraight and what is queer. So I do use this interchangeably. Probably it is frustrating sometimes, but it is, I think it adds a certain kind of elasticity and conceptual volume, which is there for the undefined in some ways, right? So I think I like that space, and I like that unclarity, so to speak, because it allows me to do some work, which, I think that's how I think about it. I did not want to create a distinction between something that's queer and something that is less queer, or it's Pakistani queer, or it wasn't about sort of, thinking, in those kinds of ways, or bringing a local term and saying, well, this is our queerness and that is just not, do you know what I mean? Like, it's sort of not to create that divide, because I thought that would not be very productive for a book like this, or for my work.
No, I thought,
and also because I want to speak back to queer theory. Sorry. Yeah.
I was just saying that I thought that the concept of the unstraight affordances that really delineate, both echo and resonate with the language of the line, of the Fakiri line, of the crossing of lines, and all of these ways in which we think in these unitary trajectories, and complicates that by pointing out that there's always choices and trade-offs and changes and opportunities and etc. That none of all of that is very deeply interconnected. And I thought, so for me, Unstraight Affordance brought a really rich new way of considering all the multiple ways of modalities of being in these spaces that that you raised. And I think we have another question here that actually is engaging with one of those sort of more unitary topics. Mohammed Yusuf is asking, he said, thank you for the wonderful talk. I look forward to reading the book. As a graduate student and 12er Shia, I especially appreciate and empathize with thinking with and from shrines and saintly histories, and asks this interesting and challenging question about the concept of tawheed or divine unity, which is so, of course, very central in Islamic theology. But is it something that comes up and is considered, actually, I think the question is asking very theoretically, like, is tawheed a useful container for the ways in which these theoretical genealogies of queer studies might be trying to dismiss ideas around divine unity? Is that a topic that is engaged or could be engaged productively?
I mean, I'm thinking like in terms of, I think there can be a productive conversation on the understanding of this kind of notion of, let's say, the multiplicity of within Tawheed, right? This kind of thinking about queerness and Tawheed in relation to one another.
Is there a kind of the kind of unity of all?
Yeah, exactly. The
going on here, that the divine unity is capacious enough to encounter multiplicities, or is that still a totalizing kind of paradigm that doesn't actually give you the space, critical space, perhaps? That.
I mean, what I would say is that in my encounters in Sevan, I think, and it's a roundabout way of talking about this. I think what was more, let's say, what was more queer through the Sufi lens was a question of plurality and fragmentation rather than the question of unity. I think there was a certain comfort in a certain kind of fragmentary knowing. I mean, even the figure of the saint, for example, he's someone that has multiple histories, right? And they're irreconcilable. They don't come together in some kind of a unified, being or whole. They don't add up. And there was a certain comfort with that among pilgrims, among fakirs. Nobody cared whether one narrative matched the other or not, whether all of these different histories had to come together in some kind of a, clean, unified space. And I think that's what is more interesting to me, and that's what is more interesting for the genealogy of queer, to think in those kind of abundant, capacious, but also fragmented understandings of the sacred, or one saintly figure, or just generally the sacred. I mean, it's also, as I said, it's a densely sacred place. There are all these kinds of multiple histories that don't really necessarily add up, that don't necessarily speak to one another. And it's also what happens in chapter 5. I mean, there's all these kinds of fairies and demons and Shia figures, Shia messianic figures, and the imams, and flying horses. And so I think there's almost a pulling away from a notion of tawheed, I would say, or oneness. And I would lean more towards that than, I mean, from my own kind of, I would say my own inclination would be to not conflate the two, but go in the other direction.
I think in Shahab Ahmed's idea of coherent contradiction, perhaps, may also be a way of venturing towards that kind of capacious quality, that it doesn't have to all add up, as it were. And I thought that was a very interesting and deliberate move that you make in this work, is to not, I mean, you're not reading the Tazkira literature and all of the poetic corpus, etc. You're really centering their people's own world-making projects. And I think that that is a very, I'm assuming that was a very deliberate choice, because at certain points you do indicate that, you know, you've done some archival digging and done this and that, but that's not the story that you're telling here. And I think that's an important choice to be explicit about.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Shahab Ahmed's work also, I think, to in this conversation. No, it makes sense what you're saying. I also think that, you know, one of my reviewers when I was doing the book, there was this desire that I should write a chapter about the saint and sort of, you know, and I made the same argument. I said, no, he's a figure who's kind of plural and fragmented, and I'd rather leave our understanding, also our coming to terms with who this figure is, through the various ways in which he gets, you know, imagined and brought up in these conversations and these lives, rather than doing, you know, those kinds of writing about the saint and looking through the archives and finding him in historical sources and all that, which of course is a project that someone can do. But I think it just didn't reflect the ways in which the saint was, like, let's say the intimacy with saint was experienced in the on the ground, so to speak, or it didn't match the ways in which people spoke about him. So I wanted him also to be a figure almost dispersed or scattered in the book.
Great. Anjali, have you any last questions as we're wrapping up?
I have many questions, but I think that, you know, I was listening to you respond to Anna's question, and I was also thinking about the chapter with the scandal, the celibacy chapter, where, and you know, in that chapter you use the language of, where you don't say interruption, but about how the kind of field of intimacy with the saint is interrupted, distracted because of these other objects that appear, right? So in many ways, I thought that your book was also actually doing that, even though you're centering the saint, you know, and you begin with the picture of Lal and you end, the saint is also in some ways decentered and becomes a hermeneutic of sorts, right? I mean, am I misreading? I thought that's why that struck me as quite interesting, because then the last coda where you sort of say it can be any casual brush, right? Literally. But so I feel like even though your book is about a place of devotion, and you end with that, a figure of devotion, it's also about a form that mutates and disseminates, right? And so that chapter was about something that went awry, but going awry is the point of your book, yeah? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, certainly. I mean, you know, when in the first chapter after the introduction, when I introduced the saint also, once again, because of this image, right? That's the other image where I'm photographed with Veena Malik and there's a saint in the background. And I talk about historiality rather than the historicity of the saint, right? It's because he's the figure that recurs always slightly differently, but in various kinds of forms, whether it's a song, whether it's image, whether it's dream, whether, you know, he's a falcon or not. And at the same time, he becomes this figure that stands in for other figures as well, because he can be Ali and he can be other, you know, so he represents, so there is this kind of, there is, so you're reading it completely, you know, you're aligned with how I'm thinking about him, or the saint in the book as well. He is this dispersed figure. He is many things. I mean, I say that mystery suits him better than history, because he's a figure who's quite slippery as a historical object. The little historical research that I did on the figure, but even in the ways which he's remembered, talked, described, embodied, you know, these are all sort of, they don't add up. So there is this idea that he can be plural. He represents a plural mythical, religious, sacred forces, and with multiple genealogies, as I earlier mentioned. So that kind of plurality of the figure is quite central.
Well, I am so thankful for this conversation, and I wish that we could just keep chatting. I would I have so many more questions and so many more things that this brings up. I thank so much to my wonderful colleague, Anjali. Thank you for coming virtually from down the road in Santa Cruz, or even further in reality, but from Santa Cruz. I would also like to thank our event's co-sponsors, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies and the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. And above all, of course, we must thank our staff, Lalitha Duperon and Samrit Matharu. We are so grateful for your help. Finally, last but absolutely not least, Omar Kasmani, you've been a delight, and it's been a privilege to learn more with you today. And I thank you so much for your time and wish you all the best with your new projects. And I look forward to learning more.
Thank you very much.